There is a column of smoke rising over the northern edge of the Las Vegas Valley, and it is not coming from the suburbs, not from the dry washes that thread down out of the mountains, not from any of the places where a desert fire usually starts. It is coming from inside the fence line of one of the most secured pieces of ground in the United States. 50,000 acres are burning inside Nellis Air Force Base, and as the latest reports come in, the fire is only 10% contained. That single number, 10%, tells you almost everything about how this night is going to go. It means that for every 10 feet of edge that crews have managed to hold, 90 feet are still open, still hot, still moving with the wind. It means the fire is not being fought so much as it is being followed. And it means that the people whose job it is to put a line around this thing are staring at a landscape that fights back in ways almost no other fire ground on Earth does. To understand why a fire inside Nellis is a different kind of emergency, you have to understand what Nellis actually is. Most people picture an airbase as a runway, some hangars, a control tower, and a cluster of buildings behind a gate. That is the part you can see from the highway. But the flying is the smallest part of the footprint. Attached to the base is the Nevada Test and Training Range, an expanse of desert larger than some entire states. Millions of acres of open Mojave and Great Basin scrub used for live fire training, bombing runs, and the kind of exercises that require enormous empty space precisely because things are being dropped and detonated out there on purpose. When a fire starts on ground like that, the firefighters are not just fighting flame and heat and wind. They are fighting the land itself. Because the land is seeded with decades of ordnance, some of it live, some of it buried, almost all of it unmapped in the granular way you would need in order to send a crew walking across it in the dark. Why 10% contained is worse than it sounds. The word contained gets used constantly during a wildfire. And almost nobody outside the fire service knows what it really means. It does not mean the fire is 10% extinguished. It does not mean 90% of the flames are still burning at full strength while a tenth have gone out. Containment is a measure of the perimeter, not the interior. When incident commanders say a fire is 10% contained, they mean that around 10% of the total edge of the fire has a completed control line, a barrier, whether it is a bulldozed strip of bare dirt, a natural feature like a road or a ridge of rock, or a hand-cut line scraped down to mineral soil that they are confident the fire will not cross. The other 90% of the edge has no such guarantee. It is open front. It can advance. So when the number is 10, what the fire managers are really telling you is that the situation is still overwhelmingly on the fire's terms. Early containment figures on a fast-moving desert fire are almost always low, and they climb slowly at first and then, if things go well, quickly toward the end. The reason the first 10% is so hard-won is that in the opening hours, crews are not building line at all. They are scouting, staging, protecting the highest value assets, and trying to figure out where the fire is even going. Only once they understand the fire's behavior can they commit resources to the flanks and start closing the box. 10% means they are still in that early reactive phase. It means the fire got a head start, and on this particular ground, a head start is extremely dangerous. There is another reason the number matters here more than it would on an ordinary range fire. Containment lines have to be anchored to something and cut by someone, and on a military range studded with unexploded ordnance. Both of those become problems. You cannot simply send a dozer wherever the tactics say the line should go. You cannot drop a crew of hand cutters into a drainage that has not been cleared. Every foot of that 10% had to be built somewhere the fire managers were confident was safe to put people and machines. That constraint alone can slow the growth of containment to a crawl, which is exactly why a desert fire that might be 40 or 50% contained on open public land can sit stubbornly in the single or low double digits when it is burning across a range like this one. The ordnance problem nobody talks about this is the part of a fire like this that makes it genuinely unlike almost anything else firefighters face. The Nevada Test and Training Range has been used for live fire training and weapons testing for the better part of 80 years. That means the ground is not empty. Scattered across large portions of it are the remnants of that history, expended and sometimes unexpended munitions, fragments, and buried ordnance, whose exact locations are not marked with the kind of precision you would need in order to walk a hand crew across the terrain at night with confidence. Fire and heat do dangerous things to ordnance. Intense heat can cook off munitions, causing them to detonate or launch fragments without any human touching them. That turns a burning drainage into something no ground commander will send firefighters into, no matter how much the tactics might otherwise call for a direct attack there. So the crews are forced into indirect strategies. Instead of building line right at the fire's edge, the fastest and most effective way to stop a fire when it is safe, they have to back off, sometimes a long way off to ground they know is clear, and build their lines there, giving up enormous chunks of territory to the flames in exchange for keeping people alive. That trade is the right one every single time. But it is why the fire is allowed to grow, why containment stays low, and why 50,000 acres can burn on a base without that number necessarily meaning anyone failed. Sometimes the safest, smartest firefight is one that looks from the outside like the fire is winning. Aircraft change this equation, but only partly. Air tankers and helicopters can drop retardant and water on ground that no human can safely stand on, and on a range fire, they become disproportionately important precisely because so much of the interior is off limits to boots. A retardant line laid down from the air does not require anyone to walk the drainage, but air support has its own hard limits. It cannot fly in the worst of the smoke and wind. It cannot work at night as freely as it can in daylight. Retardant slows a fire. It rarely stops one on its own. And every aircraft in the desert Southwest during fire season is a contested resource, spread thin across multiple incidents. So while the planes and helicopters buy time and hold flanks, they are not a substitute for the ground line that on this fire is so much harder to build than usual. How a desert burns there is a myth that the desert cannot really burn, that it is too barren, too sparse, too empty to carry a serious fire. Anyone who has watched the Mojave and the Great Basin in the wrong year knows how wrong that is. The desert does not burn like a forest. It burns like a fuse. In a wet winter and spring, the desert explodes with growth. Annual grasses, much of it invasive species like red brome and cheatgrass that have colonized the West over the last century, sprout in the gaps between the creosote and the sage, filling the ground that used to be bare. Then summer comes, the rain stops, and all of that green cures to gold and then to gray, drying into a continuous carpet of fine, flashy fuel. Fine fuels are the most dangerous kind for one simple reason: they ignite instantly and they spread fire fast. A blade of cured grass has almost no moisture to boil off and almost no mass to slow the flame down. Fire runs through it at speeds that a heavier fuel like timber could never sustain. The old desert, the sparse one, had bare ground between the shrubs that acted as natural fire breaks. The new desert, carpeted in invasive grass, has connected the shrubs together into one continuous bed of fuel. That is the transformation, more than any single spark, that makes a 50,000-acre desert fire not just possible, but increasingly ordinary. Layer heat and wind on top of that, and you have the recipe for exactly the kind of fire now burning at Nellis. The Las Vegas Valley in the deep summer routinely runs well past 100 degrees. Relative humidity drops into the single digits. The fuels already cured lose even more of their trace moisture in that furnace air, and a landscape that was merely flammable becomes explosively so. Then the wind arrives, the afternoon gusts that funnel through the passes, the erratic gusts thrown off by the fire's own heat, and it does two things at once. It pushes the flame front forward, and it throws embers ahead of the fire into unburned fuel, starting new fires that merge back into the main one. This is how a desert fire outruns the people chasing it. Not by creeping, by leaping. The fire that makes its own weather once a fire gets big enough, and 50,000 acres is more than big enough, it stops being a passive thing that the weather pushes around and becomes a force that generates weather of its own. The heat coming off a fire of this size drives a massive column of rising air. That column pulls in wind from all directions around the base of the fire to replace the air rushing upward, which means the fire begins to feed itself a supply of fresh oxygen and to generate erratic, shifting winds at ground level that make its behavior almost impossible to predict from moment to moment. High above the flames, that rising column can build into a towering pyrocumulus cloud. A fire made Thunderhead visible for 100 miles. In the worst cases, these columns collapse, slamming a rush of air back down to the surface and blowing the fire outward in every direction at once. For firefighters, a collapsing column is one of the most lethal events on any fireground because the wind that was at your back a moment ago is suddenly in your face. and the fire that was moving away is suddenly moving toward you. This is the deep reason that indirect strategy is not cowardice but survival. A fire this large, on ground this dangerous, in air this hot, can change its mind in seconds. The people fighting it have learned, often at a terrible price paid by others before them, that you do not gamble your crew against a fire that makes its own weather. What is actually at risk, the instinct hearing that a fire is burning inside an Air Force base, is to imagine the flames licking at hangars and jets. The reality is more nuanced and in some ways more reassuring. The vast majority of a base like Nellis, the flight line, the maintenance facilities, the housing, the operational core sits on developed defensible ground with roads, cleared space, and infrastructure that gives firefighters something to work with. A fire burning across 50,000 acres of the training range is, in most scenarios, burning far from those hardened facilities, out in the open desert where the base's mission puts empty space by design. The same vastness that makes the fire hard to contain also means there is a great deal of nothing between the flames and the things that matter most. That does not mean there is nothing at stake. The range itself is an asset, a training environment that cannot simply be relocated, threaded with instrumentation, targets, and infrastructure that support the flying mission. Fire can damage all of it. There are remote facilities and communication sites scattered across that ground. There is the simple fact that active training has to stop while a fire is burning across the range, which ripples out into the schedules of squadrons and exercises far beyond Nellis. And there is the ordnance itself, which fire can scatter and disturb in ways that make the eventual cleanup longer and more hazardous. The threat is real. It is just not usually the Hollywood image of a jet fighter framed against a wall of flame. The larger threat to the most people is one that never touches the base at all: the smoke. A 50,000-acre fire on the northern edge of the Las Vegas metropolitan area pushes an enormous plume of particulate into the air over a valley where more than 2 million people live. Wildfire smoke is not a nuisance. It is a genuine public health hazard, carrying fine particulate matter deep into the lungs, aggravating asthma and heart conditions, sending vulnerable people to emergency rooms, and degrading air quality for days across a huge area depending on which way the wind blows. On any given day, the difference between a bad air quality reading in the suburbs and a clear sky can come down entirely to wind direction. The fire is inside the fence. The smoke does not care about the fence at all. The machinery of a modern firefight, when a fire like this ignites, a vast and highly organized machine spins up around it. And understanding that machine is part of understanding why the 10% number is not cause for panic. Wildland firefighting in the United States runs on a system called incident command, a structure designed to scale from a single engine on a roadside brush fire to thousands of personnel on a campaign fire that burns for weeks. Within hours of a major ignition, an incident commander is named, objectives are set, and the fire is divided into geographic divisions, each with its own supervisor, its own resources, and its own piece of the plan. The priorities never change, and they are always in the same order: life safety first, then protection of the highest value assets, then containment of the fire itself. Everything the crews do flows from that hierarchy. On a range fire, life safety and the ordnance hazard push the tactics toward the indirect, and asset protection means putting resources between the fire and the base's critical infrastructure long before anyone worries about the far edges of the burn. Engines patrol the defensible flanks, dozers cut line on cleared ground. Hand crews build and improve line where it is safe to walk. Aircraft hit the interior and the runs that ground crews cannot safely approach. And behind all of it, an entire logistical operation, supply, communications, weather forecasting dedicated to this single fire, medical staging and relief crews to swap out the exhausted, keeps the whole effort fed and moving around the clock. On a military installation, this civilian machine has to mesh with the base's own emergency apparatus. Nellis, like every major installation, maintains its own fire department, its own emergency management, and its own detailed knowledge of the ground, including where the hazards lie. The most effective response to a fire like this is a joint one, blending the local expertise of the base, which knows its own range better than any outside crew ever could, with the surge capacity of state and federal wildland firefighting resources that can pour in engines, aircraft, and crews from across the region. That coordination is itself a task, and it is part of why the early hours look slow from the outside. A great deal of the initial work is not visible as flames being knocked down. It is the invisible work of organizing an enormous multi-agency response into a single coherent plan. Why this keeps happening step back from this one fire and a larger pattern comes into focus because a 50,000-acre burn on the edge of Las Vegas is not a freak event anymore. It is a symptom. The American West has moved into a fire regime that would have been almost unrecognizable a few generations ago, and the reasons stack on top of one another. The first is the long-term drying of the region. The West has spent much of the 21st century in drought, and the warming climate is loading the dice toward more heat and more evaporation, pulling moisture out of soil and vegetation and extending the window of the year during which the landscape is ready to burn. Fire season used to have clear boundaries. Increasingly, it does not. The second is the invasive grass transformation already described, the conversion of open desert into connected beds of flashy fuel, a change driven by human activity, grazing history, and the spread of species that thrive on the very fire cycle they feed. Each fire clears ground that the invasive grasses recolonize faster than the native shrubs can, so each fire makes the next one easier. It is a feedback loop, and the desert around Las Vegas is deep inside it. The third is simply that there are more of us, and we have built farther out into the landscape than ever before. The zone where development meets wildland has expanded relentlessly, which means more ignitions from human activity and more that is exposed when a fire runs. A base like Nellis, with its enormous training range abutting a metropolitan area of more than 2 million people, sits squarely at that intersection of all three forces. A drying climate, a landscape primed to carry fire, and a huge population living right up against the fuel. When those forces align on a hot, windy summer day, all it takes is a spark, and on a live fire training range, sparks are not exactly in short supply to produce exactly the kind of fire now burning across 50,000 acres with only a tenth of its edge held. The people who fight at it is easy. Watching a fire like this from a distance as a plume on the horizon or a number on a screen, to forget that behind every foot of that 10% are human beings doing some of the hardest and most dangerous physical work there is. Wildland firefighting is not the firefighting most people picture. There is no hydrant out on the range. There is no truck with a hose that can reach the flames across miles of trackless desert. The line that stops a wildfire is in the end cut by people with hand tools and machines, walking or driving into terrain that is trying its best to kill them, working shifts that can stretch to 16 hours and beyond, sleeping on the ground when they sleep at all, breathing smoke, and carrying the constant weight of knowing that the fire can turn on them. On this fire, that weight is heavier than usual. A hand crew building line in ordinary country worries about the fire, the terrain, the heat, and their own exhaustion. A crew working the edge of a live fire range has to add to that list the possibility that the ground itself might explode. That heat has cooked off a munition somewhere ahead, that a fragment is buried under the very strip of dirt they are about to cut. That is a psychological burden most firefighters never have to carry, and it changes how every decision gets made. It is why the commanders keep pulling people back to safe ground, why they lean so hard on aircraft, and why they will accept a fire growing larger rather than accept a risk they cannot control. There is an old and hard-won principle in the fire service that no acre of ground and no building is worth a firefighter's life. On a range seeded with ordnance, that principle is not an abstraction on a poster. It is the single rule that shapes the entire fight. The base's own firefighters bring something to this that no one else can. They know this range. They have trained on it, worked fires on it before, and carry in their heads a map of where the hazards concentrate that no outside crew arriving from another state could possibly match. That local knowledge, married to the sheer surge capacity that state and federal wildland resources can bring. The aircraft, the interagency hotshot crews, the engines and dozers and overhead teams that can flow in from across the region is what gives this fire its best chance of being boxed in before it does real damage. The most dangerous version of this fire is the one fought by people who do not know the ground. The version being fought at Nellis is not that, and it matters. Lessons written in old fires, none of what is happening tonight is being figured out from scratch. Every tactic, every safety rule, every decision to go indirect instead of direct is the inheritance of a century of fire, much of it learned the hardest way possible. The desert Southwest has burned before, and Nellis and its range have seen fire before. The reason a modern incident command team can look at a 50,000-acre fire on a hazardous range and calmly build a plan is that the fire service has, over decades, developed a body of doctrines specifically for exactly these situations. How to fight fire where you cannot safely put people. How to use aircraft as the primary tool instead of a supporting one. How to protect fixed assets while letting open ground burn. How to read the weather for the moment the wind will shift. Those lessons were not free. The fire service carries the memory of the firefighters who did not come home from fires that turned, from columns that collapsed, from decisions to push into ground that should have been left alone. Out of every one of those tragedies came changes. New rules about lookouts and escape routes and safety zones. New respect for the way large fires generate their own weather. New humility about what human beings can and cannot do against a fire running under extreme conditions. When the commanders at Nellis choose to hold back and let 50,000 acres burn rather than gamble a crew on ground they cannot clear, they are not being timid. They are applying the most expensive lessons the fire service has ever learned. The low containment number is, in a strange way, evidence of exactly that discipline at work. What comes next for the crews on the ground and in the air tonight? The path forward is the same one that has ended every large fire in the history of the fire service, even if it does not feel that way at 10% contained. They will hold the defensible flanks. They will protect the base's critical assets and keep the fire away from the developed core. They will use aircraft to slow the runs that boots cannot reach, and they will build line on every piece of ground they can safely stand on, slowly turning that 10% into 20, into 40, into a closed box. Weather will help or it will hurt. A drop in the wind, a rise in the overnight humidity, a break in the heat can hand the firefighters a night where containment leaps upward. A wind event can erase a day of progress in an hour. Much of what happens is decided not in a command tent, but in the atmosphere. There is also the matter of the people who live directly downwind and downslope of the burn, in the northern reaches of the valley where the suburbs press up toward the base boundary. For them, the next days are about watching the air. Keeping windows shut when the plume swings their way, keeping the vulnerable indoors, and paying attention to the guidance that comes from local air quality officials and emergency managers. A fire that never crosses the fence can still reach into tens of thousands of homes through the air alone, and the most useful thing most residents can do is simply to take the smoke seriously rather than treating it as a curiosity to photograph from the backyard. The plume that looks dramatic against the evening sky is made of the same fine particulate that does the damage, and the people most at risk from it are the ones least able to see it coming. The elderly, the very young, and anyone whose lungs or heart are already working hard. Eventually, and it may take days, the fire will be surrounded, and then the long, grinding work of mopping up begins, walking the interior or the parts of it that can be walked. Extinguishing the smoldering pockets that can otherwise flare back to life and jump a line that was supposed to hold. On this ground, even that final phase is complicated by the ordnance, which means some of the interior may simply be allowed to burn itself out under watch rather than sending anyone in to finish it by hand. And when it is over, the questions will begin. How did it start? What was damaged? How long before the range is safe to use again, given that fire may have disturbed ordnance that then has to be located and cleared all over again? The fire will be out long before the base is back to normal. But tonight, in the end, the number that matters is still 10. 10% held and 90% of it still open. 50,000 acres burning inside the fence of a place built precisely because it needed a great deal of empty space to be dangerous in. And finding out, as the whole West keeps finding out, that empty space full of cured grass and buried ordnance under a 110-degree sky is one of the hardest places on the continent to stop a fire once it starts. The smoke will rise over Las Vegas. The crews will keep working through the dark, foot by hard-won foot, and the desert, which so many people still believe cannot really burn, will go on proving them wrong, one enormous fire at a time, until we finally learn to take it seriously.